Japan's Prime Minister Naoto Kan said Tuesday his government's in state of maximum alert over the nuclear crisis at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. High radiation levels continue to delay efforts to fix the plant's cooling systems, and experts are now debating whether to cover its reactor buildings with a special material in order to try and stop the spread of radioactive substances. Radioactive water is seeping into the sea, and highly radioactive liquid has been found inside and outside several reactor buildings. Small amounts of plutonium have also been detected in soil at the plant. The Institute for Energy and Environmental Research has released data showing the radiation leak in Japan is far worse than the one at 3 Mile Island in 1979. Researchers estimate the Japanese plant has released 160,000 times as much radioactive iodine-131 as the 3 Mile Island accident. The researchers said the radiation leak in Chernobyl was 10 times larger than the leak so far in Japan. On Tuesday, Peter Lyons, the head of the U.S. Energy Department's nuclear program, said the discovery of plutonium in the soil near Japan's damaged nuclear reactors should not be a major surprise.
All operating reactors, whether they start with any plutonium in the fuel or not, build up plutonium in the course of operation. So finding plutonium that was derived from either the operating reactors or the spent fuel pools would not be regarded as a major surprise. Certainly it would be a concern if it were in significant levels. At least anything I've seen was that it's not significant at this point.
That was Peter Lyons, head of the U.S. Energy Department's nuclear program, speaking Tuesday at a hearing for the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. The hearing comes as the U.S. regulator embarks on a safety review of the nation's 104 nuclear plants in the wake of the Japanese accident, the worst the world has seen in a quarter of a century. The Obama administration says it's trying to determine how to boost energy production without increasing global warming. To discuss this issue, we're joined by British journalist George Monbiot in London. He's an author, columnist with The Guardian of London. He's written in favor of nuclear energy after the Fukushima disaster. And we're joined by Helen Caldicott, world-renowned anti-nuclear advocate, author, and pediatrician, co-founder of Physicians for Social Responsibility, has spent decades warning of the medical hazards of nuclear technologies. George Monbiot, why don't you begin? Why doesn't what is happening now in Fukushima concern you when it comes to nuclear power worldwide?
Well, obviously what's happening in Fukushima concerns me a lot about the area surrounding Fukushima. It's a horrible, dangerous, extremely traumatic series of events that we are seeing there. But I'm very worried that the global response to what's happening in Fukushima will be to shut down nuclear power stations around the world and to cancel future nuclear power stations, and that what will happen is that they will be replaced by coal. Now, coal is hundreds of times more dangerous than nuclear power. Not just because of climate change, though of course climate change is a big one, but also because of industrial accidents and because of the impacts of pollution on local people. If we just look at industrial accidents alone, these massively outweigh both the fatalities and the injuries caused by any nuclear accident we've ever seen. In China alone, last year, 2,300 people were killed in industrial accidents to do with coal mining. Purely by coal mining accidents, 2,300 killed. That's 6 people a day. That means that in 1 week, the official death toll from coal in China is greater than the official death toll from Chernobyl in 25 years. And that's to say nothing of the hundreds of thousands of people contracting really unpleasant lung diseases which will cause them a very slow and painful and terrible death. So what I'm calling for here is not complacency. I think it's absolutely appropriate to be very concerned indeed about what's happening in Fukushima. But I'm calling for perspective, and I'm saying that we must not replace a bad technology with a much, much worse one, because unfortunately, that is what's likely to happen.
Helen Caldicott, your reaction. Talk about where Japan is right now with its nuclear reactors, what partial meltdown means, and what you think this means for the future for nuclear power in the world.
Well, Amy, The Guardian yesterday reported that unit number 2 had actually melted down. The fuel had melted through the reactor vessel onto the concrete floor below. That is a problem because the zirconium in the fuel reacts with the concrete, and it could form a huge hydrogen bubble like happened at 3 Mile Island. There could be a huge hydrogen explosion which would rupture the containment vessel, and out of Unit 2 would come huge plumes of radiation which, if the wind is blowing towards the south, could devastate much of Japan forever, or it could be blown across the Pacific towards the North American continent and around the globe indeed, and pollute the whole of the Northern Hemisphere. And of course, if there is such an explosion, it means that the workers who are trying to stabilise the cooling pools, one of which has been burning, or several have been burning, and the other reactors, which are in a very precarious state, they'll have to evacuate the plant. I mean, they can't work there anymore, and then God knows what will happen. This is the most extreme situation in nuclear power. I could never have imagined this, Amy, although I have thought a lot about meltdowns and Chernobyl in particular.
George Monbiot, your response, do you agree with Helen Caldicott's assessment?
Well, I agree that it's a very parlous situation indeed. It does look as if it's going to melt through the reactor floor effectively and onto the concrete, in which case exactly the scenario she's talking about could take place. I would disagree, though, that it will devastate a large part of Japan forever, which I think was a term that she used. I think that's an overstatement of the impacts of the radiation. There's no question that it will cause mass evacuation. It may cause health effects for some people, but we've got to be very careful about not doing what, say, the climate change deniers do when they say that there's no danger from climate change. Cherry-picking studies, plucking out work which is very much against the scientific consensus. When it comes to low-level radiation, unfortunately, environmentalists have been responsible for quite a similar approach by making what appear to be unjustifiable and excessive claims for the impact of that radiation. That is not in any way to minimize what could well happen as a result of the events in Fukushima. But what it does say is we have to use the best possible science to work out what the likely effects are to be, and not engage in what could be far more devastating to the lives of people in Japan, a wild overreaction in terms of the response in which we ask the Japanese people to engage.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion. Our guests are George Monbiot of The Guardian and Helen Caldicott, world-renowned anti-nuclear advocate, co-founder of Physicians for Social Responsibility. After we continue this debate, we will go to Haiti to talk about the crisis there. Stay with us.
So why let the silence kill a true utterance? Why make the homeless scrub up your guttery? Who let the science build the righteous teachers? We let defiance lift the room full of creatures. Treasures are stolen, then dumped in the ocean. Oh, what we do to a motherland caution. Murder she wrote in her will in a eulogy. Offsprings cremate her to create energy. Smoke rise, holy figures burn in effigy. Solar eclipse on the night of an apogee. Earth spin around the doomsday clock. Messing around now, the whole building block is hot. Sliding rocks on the fly, walking on a tight cabling. Gambling the top of the periodic table. Make fate bring together minds that are able to express from an independent label. To rip a hard knock cradle, it's time to rock a show. Let the name ring worldwide, rock a show. What we don't need for show, yet another Chernobyl. Thinks like thought, but till then remain hopeful. My people, you wanna see the whole plot like a constellation. You connect the dots, see the outline. timeline of a master plan at hand. Train rhyme named Desire, headed for disaster. Charge like plasma, shatter like plaster. Cause we wanna get from point A to B faster. Set your soul on an auction bid. Better yet, set yourself a vibration kit. This theater has no spin like a turbine. No script set for this year by the genuine population. The path we must take for a major alteration. Extreme consumption to wise moderation. Enough of the debating. Get up in the morning just to see what we're facing.
Rokasho by Shingo Tu. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. After the nuclear disaster in Japan, President Obama, in an interview with CBS, reiterated his commitment to nuclear power. We thought we could go to that SOT, but President Obama is renewing the whole nuclear power debate by providing the loan guarantees that would allow for new plants to be built for the first time in more than 30 years. Helen Caldicott, are you concerned about this?
Oh, Amy, the whole thing's nuclear madness, which is what I called my first book that I wrote in 1978. A new report from the New York Academy of Sciences has just translated 5,000 papers from Russian into English. It's the most devastating report I've ever seen. Up to 1 million people have already died from Chernobyl, and people will continue to die from cancer for virtually the rest of time. What we should know is that 1/1,000,000 of a gram of plutonium or less can induce cancer, or will induce cancer. Each reactor has 250 kilos or 500 pounds of plutonium in it. There's enough plutonium in these reactors to kill everyone on Earth. Now, what George doesn't understand, and that, George, I really appreciate your writing, and I understand your concern about global warming. You don't understand internal emitters. I was commissioned to write an article for the New England Journal of Medicine about the dangers of nuclear power. I spent a year researching it. You've bought the propaganda from the nuclear industry. They say it's low-level radiation. That's absolute rubbish. If you inhale a 1/1,000,000th of a gram of plutonium, the surrounding cells receive a very, very high dose. Most die within that area because it's an alpha emitter. The cells on the periphery remain viable. They mutate and their regulatory genes are damaged. Years later, that person develops cancer. Now, that's true for radioactive iodine that goes to the thyroid, cesium-137 that goes to the brain and muscles, strontium-90 goes to bone, causing bone cancer and leukemia. It's imperative, George, because you're highly intelligent and a very important commentator, that you understand internal emitters and radiation, and it's not low level to the cells that are exposed. Radiobiology is imperative to understand these days. I do suggest, humbly, that if you read my book, Nuclear Power is Not the Answer, which I think I've tried to send you once, you'll learn about that.
Copy,
and
yeah.
I totally agree. Global warming is a terrible, terrible catastrophe. However, I commissioned a study done by Arjun Makajani from IEER about 3-4 years ago called Carbon Free, Nuclear Free. The truth is, George, that there's enough renewable technology right now, which is relatively cheap, to supply the whole of the US's needs by 2040 without any carbon and any nuclear. We just need to have the politicians to get out of the pockets of the nuclear companies, the coal companies, the oil companies, and start funding renewable energy. Why isn't there a solar panel on every single house in America? Solar hot water systems, windmills everywhere. You know, it would increase the GDP and employ hundreds of thousands of people throughout the world. This is the way to go. That's the prescription for survival. Nuclear power, George, creates massive quantities of radioactive waste. There's nowhere to put it on Earth that's safe. As it leaks into the water over time, it will bioconcentrate in the food chains, in the breast milk, in the fetuses that are thousands of times more radiosensitive than adults. 1 X-ray to the pregnant abdomen doubles the incidence of leukemia in the child. And over time, nuclear waste will induce epidemics of cancer, leukemia, and genetic disease, and random compulsory genetic engineering. And we're not the only species with genes, of course, it's plants and animals. So this is an absolute catastrophe, the likes of which the world has never seen
Let's
before.
get George Monbiot's response.
Yes, well, thank you, Helen, and thank you for all the work you've done over the years, which I think has made a fantastic contribution. But what you were saying about the impacts of radiation does not seem to square with the observed cancer rates amongst populations who have been
That's not
exposed
right.
to higher levels
George, that's
of
not right.
radiation.
George,
well, can I
George,
just
it's
give
not
you
right. You need to read the literature.
George
Well, I
Monbiot.
have been reading the literature. I have been reading the literature, and there's a very
The
extensive
medical literature? Have you read the New York Academy of Sciences report?
I haven't read the whole report. I've read part of it, but can I just say that
You must read the whole report.
You know, sorry, Helen, would you please let me finish what I'm trying to say?
Sorry, George.
When I've been dealing with climate change over the past 20 years or so, I learned very quickly that you have to effectively go with the scientific consensus rather than with a few outlier papers, because to choose those outlier papers over the scientific consensus is effectively to cherry pick or to data mine and to get what turns out to be a misleading view. That's certainly been my experience with climate change. Now, when it comes to radiation, I think we're in danger possibly of falling into a similar trap to the trap that climate change deniers have fallen into with their cherry picking of the science there. For instance, I don't think you could dismiss the UN Scientific Committee as being part of the nuclear industry. I don't think you can dismiss the very large amount of data on the... Sorry, you're saying you would dismiss the UN Scientific Committee as being part of the nuclear industry?
Yes, let me tell you, George, that
Okay,
the
well,
International Atomic Energy Agency...
No, the UN
I'll tell you
Scientific
why in a
Committee is
minute.
what I'm talking about. But, I mean, if that is the case, then it worries me, the UN Scientific Committee on Atomic Radiation, it worries me if you really do lump them in there, that we're getting into the same sort of conspiratorial thinking that you have with climate change denial, whereby anyone who doesn't go along with the line of the climate change deniers that carbon dioxide is not connected with climate change, for example, is in the hands of the carbon trading industry or something like that. Now, you know, there is a very large body of evidence from Chernobyl, from many other nuclear incidents, from people's exposure to elevated levels of background radiation, whether it's radon gas coming from granite masses, whether it's higher solar radiation because of where they live, and what we do not see is that clear relationship between those lower levels of radiation that you predict and the incidence of cancers, let alone the higher incidence of death. It's just, it's only there in very particular cases, generally with extremely high exposures of radiation, or in specific cases like, for instance, the combination of radon exposure and smoking, which raises the incidence of lung cancer among smokers from 10% to 16%. But the radon exposure seems to have almost no impact on the level of cancers among the rest of the population. So I just think, you know, we've got to be very, very careful about which science we trust and which we do not.
Helen Caldicott.
George, you must listen to me. I'm a paediatrician. I'm a physician, highly trained. I was on the faculty at Harvard Medical School. My specialty is cystic fibrosis, the most common genetic disease of childhood. I actually, and I'm not boasting, but I'm a very good doctorate. You know, I came second in my year of medicine. I don't say things that are inaccurate, otherwise I would be deregistered. I mean, doctors can't lie. George, there's a huge literature on internal emitters and radiation. The New York Academy of Science, this report on Chernobyl is absolutely devastating, but there are now 2,600 genetic diseases described. I first learned about radiation by learning about the experiments with Drosophila fruit fly by Muller when I did first-year medicine in '56. You can produce a gene for a crooked wing that's passed on generation to generation. We will not live to see the abnormalities created by radiation from our activities now, because, you know, we'll all be dead by the time we have 20 or more generations. But it's imperative that people understand that internal emitters cause cancer, but the incubation time for cancer is any time from 2 to 60 years. George, the International Atomic Energy Agency has an unholy alliance with the WHO, World Health Organization, which says WHO cannot examine any accident related to nuclear power, etc., without the permission of the IAEA. And indeed, it didn't examine Chernobyl. 40% of the European landmass is still radioactive, George. Turkish food is extremely radioactive. And we have to wait to see the cancers arising and do epidemiological studies, many of which have been done to expose populations. George, there's no debate about this. There's no debate. I speak to doctors all the time in medical schools, in hospitals, grand rounds. We all understand this. There is no debate in the medical
let me ask
community.
George Monbiot.
Only at the nuclear
let me
level.
ask George Monbiot. The 25th anniversary of Chernobyl is 3 weeks away. Scientists have documented extreme levels of radiation still there, miles and miles of dead trees, mutated birds, insects, leukemia deaths of children. Is this your understanding?
Oh, miles and miles of dead trees. I don't believe that there's that's an effect of Chernobyl. It might well be an effect of acid rain in the area, but I haven't seen any scientific evidence suggesting miles and miles of dead trees caused by the Chernobyl erosion or of widespread impacts amongst wildlife. Now, as for the leukemia incidence, yes, unquestionably, thyroid cancer actually was the big one amongst children. There was some elevated incidence of leukemia amongst particularly a few of the workers at Chernobyl, but the broader impact was of thyroid cancer, and that could have been massively reduced, that incidence, A, by giving iodine pills to children, and B, by forbidding them for a period of time from drinking the contaminated milk, because the authorities were so appallingly lax and didn't do either of those basic precautions. We see a much higher rate of thyroid cancer amongst children than there ever should have been. Now, on these questions that Helen raises, I mean, if she's honestly saying that the World Health Organization is now part of the conspiracy and the cover-up as well, then the mind boggles. Where does this end?
The mind does boggle.
Them and the UN Scientific Committee and the IAEA, and I mean, who else is involved in this conspiracy? We need to know.
Finally, Helen Caldicott.
Yes, we do. It's the IAEA which promotes nuclear power. Oh, sorry, Amy. It's the IAEA that promotes nuclear power, right, but says you mustn't build bombs from your reactor. And that negotiation took place, several decades, quite a lot of decades ago. And the WHO just does not, it has not examined the results. Yes, this is the biggest medical conspiracy and cover-up in the history of medicine, George. Yes.
So the WHO, IAEA, the UN Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation,
I
all
don't
of them
know about
are part
the UN
of the cover-up.
Scientific Committee.
Well, that's
certainly
you
the
don't know about it. I mean, this
and
is,
the WHO.
The UN Scientific Committee is the major repository of the science on this issue. You don't know about it?
Well, yeah, no, I've read about it, but the main thing is that the WHO has prevented or did not examine the results from Chernobyl, and it's ongoing and will be for generations and generations, George.
But the United Nations did.
40% of the soil in Europe is contaminated.
The United Nations Committee did examine Chernobyl, and they said that so far the death toll from Chernobyl amongst both workers and local people is 43. Sorry, are you saying you didn't know that they'd examined this and you aren't aware of their report?
That's a lie.
What's a lie?
How dare,
they
yes, I
examined
am.
this
How
and they wrote a
dare
report?
they say that?
On that,
How
But are
dare
you
they
aware-
say
are
that?
you
This is
aware
a
of the
total
report?
cover-up.
we're going to wrap with 10 seconds
yes,
of
I am.
in this
I
wake
am.
of what has happened in Japan and on this anniversary of Chernobyl 3 weeks away. I give you each 15 seconds to express your concern as we wrap up this debate, beginning with George Monbiot.
Well, we have to use the best available science, not cherry-pick our sources, and we have to keep some perspective on this so that we don't see a massive rush to coal as governments get out of nuclear as a result of what's happened in Japan.
And Helen Caldicott, 15 seconds.
George, I totally agree with you about coal. I think it's a deadly substance and we must stop burning a la James Hansen. But we must not go from the global warming frying pan into the nuclear fire, George. This is an obscene technology. They've known about it since the Manhattan Project. Seaborg, who discovered plutonium, said it's the most dangerous substance on Earth. Each reactor has 500 pounds of plutonium. It lasts for 500,000 years, causing cancer after cancer.
We leave it there, and I thank you both for being with us.
Have you ever tried to help a child died of leukemia, George?
We will leave it there. Helen Caldicott, thank you so much for being with us from Boston, world-renowned anti-nuclear advocate, author and pediatrician, co-founder of Physicians for Social Responsibility, and George Monbiot speaking to us from Britain, reporter, correspondent, columnist for The Guardian of London.